You know, whether we like it or not, we often do everything we can to avoid a crisis. Whether you're a leader, creative leader, producer, whatever you do for a living, when crisis happens, we almost try to run away from it, try to make sure it doesn't happen. But I want to tell you a secret today, and that's that a crisis could actually build your career. Responding correctly in a crisis could help take you to the next level. You know, whether you want it or not, whether you're ready or not, a crisis is going to come. Sooner or later in your career, I'm sure you've already experienced them probably up to this point, but at some point a crisis is going to happen. The question is, how do you respond? Now, in saying this, I'm not advocating that we create a crisis to help our career move forward. I'm not advocating that you start looking for a crisis to manipulate for your career. I'm just saying that very often how you respond to a crisis can make a dramatic difference in your career. Back in 2001, you remember 9/11 happened. I'll never forget. I was actually watching the news that morning. I was watching the Today Show when it happened, and suddenly they switched live to the second plane flying into the building. It was a horrible, horrible, tragic, incident, probably the worst that's ever happened on the soil here in the United States. And I just remember noticing that every network, every TV network, every radio network was breaking into their regularly scheduled program to cover it. And I was fascinated by that. People were watching it all over the world. But I noticed that Christian networks, whether they were Christian television networks, Christian radio networks, they were just going about business as usual. They didn't. It's like they didn't even notice what was going on. And I know there's a lot of reasons for that. Christian programming is scheduled way in advance, but then again, so is secular programming. Christian programming really doesn't have the budgets to cover things live. I get that. And they don't have the news teams and things to break into regular programming and suddenly go live with some story. But you know what? I recognized early on that America needed some kind of a spiritual response. We couldn't just let this go by without addressing it in some way. And so I ran to my office. I'll never forget, I went to my office and I started typing out a memo, really some guidelines that if you own a Christian television station or you own a Christian radio station, here's some things you should consider doing right now. And I talked about breaking into local programming and going to get somebody who is an expert in this area, local pastors, local spiritual leaders, counselors, whatever, so we can mount kind of a spiritual response. People were asking why and what's the meaning of all this. And of course, secular television and secular radio news could bring you what's going on, but they couldn't really talk much about the why of what's happening and what it means from a spiritual perspective, especially. So I wrote this memo, and this is back in the early days of email, 2001. And so a lot of the ways I sent it out was fax. I had a directory of Christian television and Christian radio stations across the country. And I faxed a ton of these out, and I emailed some. And what was interesting was I immediately started getting a response. It was interesting because people from all over the country would say, I got your memo. I'm going to do it. We're going into a production meeting right now, and I'm going to start going through your guidelines, and we're going to start doing exactly what you said. I was actually kind of surprised that so many people responded so quickly and in such a positive way. So what happened was Christian television stations, Christian radio stations started breaking into their local programming, and I suggested, and here's the thing to know about it. I wasn't just being vague with the idea. I didn't say, you need to have a response or you need to break into local programming. I said, here's 8 or 10 things you could do. You think about it. And I said, go to a local university, find an archaeology professor, history professor, a Islamic scholar. Let's interview them and find out some about this. Get some context. Let's get local pastors who particularly are trained or understand what's going on in the Middle East right now. Go someone from the Jewish community. So I had about 8 or 10 suggestions of what they could actually do. So it made it really easy for them to make some calls and create a program around that. And so I was just pleasantly surprised and felt really good about how many Christian stations and both radio and TV broke in and offered America really a spiritual response to what was going on. Now, here's the interesting thing about that whole thing. I say the story because I noticed that shortly after that, they started calling me about other things. They said, we got the memo, we did what you suggest. Now, we'd like your advice on this, or we'd like your advice on that. And up to that point in my career, I was pretty much a television director and a television producer. Did a lot of writing, but mostly I was just a freelance producer, a director. But from that moment on, I started being looked at in a completely different way. And we started getting so many calls about consulting with people, coaching people, advising them on strategies and things, that I started having to hire other people on our team. And so that memo was a real turning point in my career and in the development of our company for the direction we would go in the future. So it's a great example of the fact that that crisis, as tragic and horrible as it was, the way I responded to it changed the perception of how people viewed me. And it made a huge difference, and it kind of launched us into a whole nother level of advising and consulting different nonprofit organizations, churches, ministries, religious organizations of all kinds on how they can use the media more effectively. So I say all that because I think it's incredibly important for you to realize that the way you handle a crisis can be absolutely critical in the way people perceive you. Now, like I say, don't go out there and start looking for a crisis, but even day-to-day issues that come up. There's a great story. Carly Fiorina, who was the CEO at Hewlett-Packard. You might remember she ran for president a number of years ago. She's gone on to AT&T. She's consulting. She's just a great mentor for a lot of leaders out there. She tells an amazing story that I just think is a fantastic story about when she had a relatively small leadership team. I think it was at Hewlett-Packard. And she said they had an engineer on the team. His name was Jim. And she said Jim was a quiet guy, exactly what you'd think about when it comes, in terms of being an engineer. He was quiet. He didn't play the game. He wasn't a social climber. He pretty much ate lunch at his desk, wasn't terribly outgoing, but he was a great engineer. And when she was sitting around with her leadership team one day, she said, okay, guys, what do you see as problems out there? What can we address? What do we need to embrace? What do we need to do? And Jim kind of sheepishly raised his hand and said, well, I see a problem. And she said, well, Jim, what's the deal? And he said, I design circuit boards for a living. And he said, I'm noticing there's a difference between the circuit boards we design and the way we bill for those circuit boards. Now, keep in mind, the billing was completely outside of his area. He had nothing to do with the billing, but he had noticed that there was a discrepancy in the way they were billing for the circuit boards he was designing. So he brought it up. And she said, well, it's funny because a lot of leaders at that point, I can tell you, would have said, well, you know what, Jim, thanks, but that's the billing department. We'll let them deal with that, and just kind of blown him off. Most leaders would say, stay in your lane, Jim. You're an engineer. Do what engineers do and shut up. That's the way most engineers would have responded. But Carly said, well, Jim, what should we do? How should we address this? And he said, well, I think we should look closer at it. So they started looking at the problem between the circuit boards he designed and the way it was built. Guess what? They discovered that they were billing short. They were billing less than they should have been, and $300 million in profit later, Jim was never blown off again. He was never invisible at that company again. They actually made $300 million in profit fixing the problem in billing that Jim had pointed out. It was interesting. She said, after that $300 million incident, nobody dismissed Jim anymore. Everybody wanted to have Jim's ideas and listen. And here's the lesson. That could have been a crisis. That could have been a problem. And it wasn't in Jim's area of expertise. He just noticed in a completely different department, there seemed to be a discrepancy, but he stepped up. And because of the way he stepped up, he was never looked at the same way again. So, my word today is a crisis will happen, a problem will happen. And remember, leaders move toward problems. They don't run away from problems. They move toward problems, run towards problems. And my philosophy of creativity is just problem solving. You want to move your career up to the next level? Find a bigger problem to solve. That's the key. That's the single greatest thing you could learn about leadership right there. You want to go to the next level? Find a bigger problem to solve. A crisis is going to happen. It's going to come. And you don't look for them. You don't try to find a crisis that you can manipulate. But the way you step up, the way you handle a crisis, trust me, will completely change the way people perceive you and the way they think you are and how you respond to things. So the bottom line, it can help your career as just about as much as anything. So as I said, it was a fairly short episode today, but I think this is such an important concept that I really want you to get into your spirit. Be aware, be observant. I really believe that one of the things that's helped me in my career more than anything else is being aware of things. I grew up as a kid in the country. I grew up outside of Charlotte, North Carolina, right on the outskirts. And I would take my dog Boots and we'd go into the woods and spend 8-9 hours a day. I mean, we did things then that moms would never let their kids do now. And yet I learned to be insanely observant about things. I would see things that nobody else saw. And I think more than ever, that's helped me be alert to a potential crisis, a potential problem, a potential issue. And so if you can learn how to start keeping your eyes open, being observant about the things that surround you, it'll make a dramatic difference in your career. A crisis could be the thing that builds your career and takes you to the next level. Thank you for tuning in. I really appreciate it. I'm honored that you come and listen to this stuff. And I love to rant about these things because they are important for creative leaders. And subscribe, so you're going to get the next episode, the next, and the next. It's going to come. And also, if you're watching on YouTube, by the way, like us, comment, share, subscribe to us on YouTube. You can subscribe to us on our podcast, comment, share. I just want you to get in the rhythm of hearing these teachings every week so you can start understanding what's going on and how these things are happening out there in the creative world, because we live in a world of such distraction that we need to learn how to focus on the creativity that's in front of us and inspire other people to do the same. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.